Hello and welcome to formal rules to test the validity of syllogisms. So in this lecture we will be discussing all the rules which are used to test the validity of syllogisms. We already know what is a categorical syllogism. We also know that there is something, the concept of standard form categorical syllogism. That means whenever a syllogism needs to be or is given to us, we need to first turn it to a standard form categorical syllogism. Now the first rule says that a valid standard form categorical syllogism has exactly three terms, each of which occurring twice. Now this is also the definition. So if it breaks that rule, so it is called as the fallacy of four terms. It is also called as quaternio terminorum. That means that it is having four terms. Now suppose if we take an example, like suppose if there is an example which is given as all P is M. Now this is one premise. The second premise says all S is, say, M, and the conclusion says therefore all S is T. Now if you see this syllogism, you see that there is one term P, one term S, one term M, and one term T. So we have P, S, T and M. There are four terms. Now this is the problem, right? Now there can be syllogisms, or there can be an argument. There can always be an argument which is valid and it is having more than three terms, right? But then it will not be a categorical syllogism. That is the whole idea. So the first rule actually puts a test or puts a check on whether the syllogism or whether the argument which is given to us is basically a syllogism or not. So therefore we call it the fallacy of four terms. In fact, there can be more than four terms. Like suppose if here in place of M there is Z, so you will find that there are five terms, right? Or in fact, if from here I remove this S and say I put it as R, so there will be six terms, right? So irrespective of the fact that it is having six terms or five terms or four terms, it will always be called as the fallacy of four terms. That means that it is having more than three terms in the argument, and therefore it is not a categorical syllogism, right? So the idea of putting this as the first rule is to put a check on whether the syllogism which we are planning to test is a categorical syllogism or not, right? Because all the rules which will be followed after this will be applied on basically a categorical syllogism. So the idea is that we cannot apply the rules of categorical syllogism on something which is not a categorical syllogism, right? So the first rule says that there should be exactly three terms, each of which occurring twice, and it should be a categorical syllogism. If it is more than, it is having more than three terms, so it will be called as the fallacy of four terms, irrespective of the fact that it is having six terms or even five terms, right? So that is the idea. So it may not be called as the rule to test the validity of syllogism. Rather, it should be called as a test to check whether we have a syllogism or not. Okay, so let us now start with the basic rules, because there are actually six rules. So the first rule, you may not find it in some books because some books may not be even dealing with this rule, but this is the first rule to check, or this is the first rule which you should always apply. The second rule says undistributed middle. So the fallacy is called as the undistributed middle. Now what does it mean? It says that the middle term must be distributed at least once in the premise. Now this is a very important thing, that whenever we have a categorical syllogism, if the middle term is not distributed even in one premise, then this rule will be breaking, right? Or the violation of this rule will lead to fallacy of undistributed middle. If you understand fallacy, fallacy is basically a mistake in reasoning, right? So like suppose if we take an example, like suppose if we have some M is P. Suppose this is the first statement, and suppose we have all S is M, right? So this is the second statement, or this is the second premise, and therefore some S is P. Now this is the third statement or the conclusion of the argument. Now if you see the distribution, So here we know that since it is an I proposition, none of the terms are distributed, right? Since it is an A proposition, the subject term is distributed, however the predicate term is not distributed. And also in the conclusion you will see that both the terms are not distributed. So not a problem. Now, if we have to check that whether the middle term is distributed in the major premise, no. Whether the middle term is distributed in the minor premise, again no. So now the problem will be that then it is having undistributed middle. That means that the middle term is not even distributed once in the premise. If this rules break, then we call it a fallacy of undistributed middle. So this is the second test which you have to put in order to check whether the syllogism is valid or not. Now let us come to the third rule. The third rule is known as the fallacy of illicit process. Now it is called as illicit process. Now what does it mean? Illicit process says that if a term is distributed in the conclusion, then it must be distributed in the premise, right? So it's not saying vice versa. If the term is distributed in the premise, then it has to be distributed in the conclusion. But it very clearly states that if a term is distributed in the conclusion, then it has to be distributed in the premise. Now suppose it has two parts, in fact. One will be called as illicit major and the other is called as illicit minor. Now what is illicit major and illicit minor? If the major term is distributed in the conclusion, right? Because we define major term and minor term from the conclusion only, right? And after that we can also set it in the premise. So if the major term is distributed in the conclusion, then it has to be distributed in the premise. Similarly, if the minor term is distributed in the conclusion, then it has to be distributed in the premise. For example, like suppose if we have a syllogism where the conclusion says like sum S is not P, suppose, right? And here we have all M is P, right? And here we have sum M is not S, suppose, right? So now if we see the distribution, we see that this term is distributed, this term is not distributed. Here this term is not distributed, however this term is distributed, and here this term is not distributed, but this term is distributed, because we know that an A proposition, this is an A proposition, right? So in A proposition, the subject term will be distributed, the predicate term will not be distributed. In an O proposition, the subject term is not distributed, however the predicate term is distributed. And similarly, this is also an O proposition, so the subject term is not distributed, however the predicate term is distributed. So you can see that this term is distributed over here, right? That means the P term is distributed over here, but it is not distributed over here, so it will commit the fallacy, right? That is illicit major. Similarly, if we have to take a minor example, so suppose if we have in conclusion all S is P, right? And here we have all M is P, and here we have all S is, or say all M is S, right? Now if you see the distribution, this is distributed, this is not distributed, this is distributed, this is not distributed, this is distributed, this is not distributed, right? So again, if you see in the conclusion, you will find that the subject term, that is the minor term, is distributed, right? But then if you see the minor term here, it is not distributed. So this will have the fallacy of illicit minor. So illicit process is basically a couple of fallacies. What are those fallacies? It says that if a term is distributed in the conclusion, then it has to be distributed in the premise. Now here the major term was distributed in the conclusion, but it was not distributed in the premise. Similarly, the minor term was distributed here, but then the minor term was not distributed in the premise. So it commits the fallacy, right? So this is a simple thing. We will take examples in the next lecture or in the next video. So you will have ample amount of practice, but first you need to understand the theory. Okay, so we have covered three rules to test the validity of syllogism. There are three more. The first three are a little bit tricky, or you need to understand them with a little bit of depth, because you need to always work them out, right? The next three are easier to find. So let us take the fourth one. The fourth rule or the fallacy is called as exclusive premises fallacy. Exclusive premises. Now, what does exclusive premises mean? Exclusive premises says that no conclusion follows from two negative premises. Now, suppose if in an argument, if categorical syllogism is given and the premises are like E, and then whatever, or it is E, O, and then whatever, or O, E, and whatever is the conclusion, or say O, and whatever is the conclusion. In these cases, it will always be having the problem of exclusive premises. That means because a categorical syllogism cannot have a conclusion if we have two negative premises, right? So whatever you write as a conclusion, whether you write as an E or I or O or A, whatever you write on these conclusion parts, because if you know the mood understanding, so irrespective of whatever figure it is, if the first two things in the mood, that means the major premise and the minor premise, both of them are negative, because E is a universal negative proposition, O is a particular negative proposition, so we know that they are negative propositions. So if this is EE or EO or OE or OO, then no conclusion follows out of it. This is the problem, or this is what we call as the fallacy of exclusive premises. So this is a simple one to understand. Now, let us take the fifth one. The fifth one also says a very simple thing, that no affirmative conclusion follows from a negative premise. Now, what does it mean? That, like, suppose I will write it as no negative conclusion, or sorry, no affirmative, no affirmative conclusion follows from a negative premise. No affirmative conclusion follows from a negative premise. What does it mean? It says that suppose in a categorical syllogism, one premise is negative, right? So the conclusion will also be negative. The conclusion cannot be affirmative. That is the idea. That is something which it says. So if, like, suppose we have A and E as premises, so the conclusion will always be a negative one. That means it will be an E or an O proposition. Similarly, if it is A and O, then the conclusion will be again a negative proposition. Or it is something like that, EA or OA, and so on, right? So from rule number 4 and rule number 5, there are certain corollaries which follows. First thing is that no conclusion follows from negative. So if there are two negative premises, there will be no conclusion whatsoever. This is the first thing which you should understand. Second is, if there is a affirmative premise and a negative premise, then the conclusion will be negative, right? So this is also something which says or which comes out from the fifth rule. And by virtue of the fourth and fifth rule, you can also understand this. However, we need to prove it, and we will be proving it in the class, or we will be proving it in one of the lectures which we will be developing. Suppose if both the premises are affirmative, then the conclusion will also be affirmative. So this is also something which you should understand from these two rules. So from these two rules, this is also something which is following out. So this is also something which you should remember. Now let us come to the last rule, right? The last rule is a rule which is added in the 20th century. It was not the part of original studies or the studies which were taken by the medieval logicians. Actually, Aristotle gave the categorical syllogisms. He had a very different way of testing. He used the method of reductio. He also used something called turning all the all the syllogisms into first figure syllogisms, and he has also used the concept of ecthesis, but all these things are not there in your course, so nothing to worry about. Then these medieval logicians, they developed a lot of rules for testing the validity of syllogisms, and all these rules are basically the rules which are coming from the medieval logicians contribution. But then the medieval logicians faltered on one thing, and that is something which is added in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century with the intervention of Boole and Frege and Venn diagrams and so on. We will be discussing Venn diagrams as well. The sixth rule which says, and the fallacy is called as existential fallacy. Existential fallacy says that a particular conclusion does not follow out of two universal premises. It means that if both the premises are universal, like if both the premises are universal, right, whether they can be A or AE, right, or EA, because EE cannot come because then it will break the fourth rule. So if both the premises are universal, then the conclusion also has to be universal. This is the thing. Particular conclusion will not follow out of these things. So this is the rule which was added by the modern logicians, the Fregians and the Boolean understanding, and it came as that from two universal premises only a universal conclusion follows. Now from this and the fourth and the fifth rule, there are certain things more, like if you have a universal premise and a particular premise, then the conclusion is particular. This is something which we will be solving at a later stage, right? Or you can try on your own as well. And if both the premises are particular, right, then again no conclusion follows out of it. So this is also something which you should know. So if you go for a simple revision of these things, what you need to do, first, whenever you find a categorical syllogism, you need to first turn it into a standard form categorical syllogism. After you put it or turn it into a standard form categorical syllogism, the first thing which you should check is whether it is having three terms, each of which occurring twice. So you will see that if you are given a standard form, if you are given a categorical syllogism, and when you will be turning it into a standard form categorical syllogism, you will find that it will have three terms, each of which occurring twice. So the first rule is taken care of. Now, the second thing which you should test is whether the middle term is distributed at least once in the premises. It can be distributed in both the premise, no problem, but it should be distributed at least once in the premise. If it is not distributed in any of the premise, then undistributed middle will come. Then you have to check. Now, the thing is that whenever you are given a categorical syllogism, it may not have only one violation. It can have more violations. Like it can have a syllogism. We can take an example as well. Like suppose if we take an example, I remove this and take an example, right? Suppose I take some M is P and some S is M. Therefore, therefore, no S is P. Now, suppose if we take this syllogism, right? We do not know whether it is valid or invalid, so we will test it. Now, we know that it is having three terms. One is M, one is P, and one is S. And it is a standard form categorical syllogism because you can see that the S term is here and the P term is here. So it is taking care of all these things. You can also name it. It is I, E, and this is the first figure, right? So we also can name it. Now, once we are checking it in this term, that whether the middle term is distributed, but then we have to see which terms are distributed here. There, if you see the distribution, because it is an I proposition, none of the terms are distributed. Since it is an I proposition, again none of the terms are distributed, and it is an E proposition, both the terms are distributed. Okay, fine. Now let us check whether the middle term is distributed at least once in the premise. No. The middle term is not distributed in the major premise. The middle term is not distributed in the minor premise. So it is breaking the rule. Now, let us come to the third rule, that is illicit process. Illicit process says that if any term is distributed in the conclusion, then it must be distributed in the premise. Now, if you see, the term S is distributed in the conclusion, but then it is not distributed. So illicit minor will come. Similarly, illicit major will come because the major term is distributed in the conclusion, but the major term is not distributed in the premise, right? So these things you have to check. So a syllogism, like in this syllogism, there are three fallacies, right? Undistributed middle, illicit minor, illicit major. So you need to understand these things, that it's not the case that a syllogism will break only one rule. It can break more than one rule. Similarly, after you have checked the first three rules, then you come to the next three rules. You need to check whether the syllogism is having both the premises as negative. If they are both negative, then again no conclusion follows. So you can say that it is exclusive premises fallacy. Now you have to check that whether the conclusion is affirmative. Yes. If the conclusion is affirmative, then the premises should be affirmative. Or if one of the premises is negative, then the conclusion must be negative. So you have to check this for the fifth rule. Similarly, in the last rule, you have to check if both the premises are universal, then the conclusion must be universal, right? If it is breaking, again, you have to check. So these are basically few ways to check the validity of syllogism. And in fact, it's a very, I will say, potent way of checking the validity of syllogisms. And once you master these rules and once you remember these rules, it will be easier for you to apply these things. In the next lecture, we will be discussing the Venn diagrams for testing the validity of syllogisms. However, before that, we will do some exercises, or maybe we can take the Venn diagrams technique first, and then we can take exercises where we can check the validity of syllogism both using the formal rules as well as using the Venn diagram technique. But those are certain things which will be following in next few lectures. But the thing is that you need to remember all these rules, and you need to see for yourself that whether a rule is breaking or not. If a rule is breaking, then which rule is breaking, and therefore the syllogism is invalid. You need to note it down. That is the idea. So practice and come out with all the doubts in the class. Thank you.